Indeed, good afternoon, welcome. My name is Peter Akaba. This is KTN Business Today, this special edition. Today we have a heavy focus on matters debt, especially in the public sector. And today, we especially want to crack this with a conversation with the man who literally bears this burden for us. That is Raphael Owino-Otieno. He is the Director General of the Public Debt Management Office at the National Treasury, a man who's had extensive experience across 3 decades of experience in economics, public debt management, and fiscal policy, having worked in the Central Bank of Kenya and now at the National Treasury. Karibu sana, sir.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm very glad to be here.
We are happy to have you here, especially because of the fact that many times when people in Kenya hear about debt, they're often hearing it from politicians who are not necessarily experts. So it's nice to have you in studio to shed light on the questions that Kenyans may have. And to start us off, talk to us about essentially Kenya's debt stock currently. What's the situation? Where are we?
Yeah, at the moment, if you are looking at the total debt in terms of the Kenya shillings, our debt is at 10.58 trillion Kenya shillings. That comprises about 5.4 trillion in domestic debt and 5.1 trillion in external debt. Yeah, the external debt, of course, this is borrowed from different creditors.
Yes.
Previously, we used to borrow largely from what we call concessional creditors, the multilaterals, the World Bank, African Development Bank, those kind of institutions. And then the bilaterals, the French government, the Japanese government, and of course, of late, a very big partner is the Chinese government that is also playing a very big role in our development agenda. But then from 2013, 2014, then we started now going a lot more commercial, where we are borrowing from the international market through Eurobonds, and of course also to support whatever we are getting from these other sources.
Yes. Yeah. So a lot of people then come into that situation with a perception question. And I'm not saying that that is exactly the right way to put it, but then they ask, where we stand, is it a good or bad place? Because for them, the things are two ways. Most people, the man on the street will not understand that debt is a rolling thing that is gotten to move. And so they want to know, is this are we in a bad place? Are we managing our debt? Are we doing well?
I think the starting point would probably be, before I give you a verdict of whether we are in a good or bad place, the starting point probably for me would be, what role has debt played over the years in our development agenda? And it has been significant. You can mention several hospitals that if it was not for borrowing, we wouldn't have constructed. Equipping several colleges, TVET, universities, equipping schools that we wouldn't have done if we did not borrow. Roads, you can name so many of the roads that have been done. They take a super highway here. Other roads, very critical link roads across the country that have been done through borrowing. Talk of our masterpiece infrastructure here called the SGR that has transformed transport between Mombasa and Nairobi, and we are hoping that eventually we will do it up to the border that will then transform the link between Kenya and Uganda, Rwanda, up to DRC. So it has played a very critical role in our development agenda, because the revenues we are collecting are not enough to meet our recurrent expenditure needs plus our development needs. So the gap that the borrowing has been filling has been very critical. Are we in a bad situation or a good situation? Now, I wouldn't want to sit here and lie to you that we are in a very good situation, because currently the cost of debt service is very high because of the borrowing that we have done historically. So like at the moment, the pressure that we are having on the budget, a lot of it is also coming from what we borrowed previously, and therefore the debt service is very high. But the government is very conscious about that and has measures in place that we have spelled out even in our policy documents that have been made public, like the medium-term debt management strategy, on how we are addressing that, how we are dealing with that from now and going into the medium term.
So then for most Kenyans, and I'm happy you brought up the MTDS, is they keep wondering, because they've been feeling the pain, they've been hearing the cacophony, so to say, from various quarters, and they're wondering, what's the way forward? What's the way out of this? What do we have to look forward to? What are those measures? Spell it out for us in terms of the proactive things that are being done to ensure that this plays out in a way that makes it sustainable and removes pressure that we've been facing.
Yeah, there are critical things that we are doing at the moment.
Yes.
Some of them, one, maybe this is too complex, but what we are calling liability management operations.
Yes.
Within our debt stock, we have concessional loans. That is loans borrowed at very, very low rates, and have a longer period that we service them. Those we have no worry about, because the pressure of repaying them and servicing them is much lower. So we are not having any issue with those. But there are these commercial components that the interest rates are a little high, and the repayment pressure is too high. So what we are doing at the moment is to look at innovative financing mechanisms where we can get an instrument that is much cheaper, sometimes guaranteed by institutions such as the World Bank or by some bilateral countries, much cheaper, and then we will be using those to retire this old expensive debt, so that we remove the expensive debt from our debt stock, and we come to a situation where whatever is in our debt stock is the instrument that don't give us a lot of pressure. But in addition to that, currently our biggest pressure is coming from domestic debt. And why is that the case? That is because the interest rates have really increased in the last 2 years. And that was because the advanced economies were tightening monetary policy. The emerging markets and developing economies also followed the same, tightened monetary policy. The CBK here in Kenya, remember, between 2022 and this year, increased the policy rate from 7% to up to 13%. That with itself came increase in treasury bill rates, treasury bond rates, up to the point where in the recent past we were paying 18% on treasury bonds. That's very expensive. 16% on treasury bills.
And the infrastructure bond.
The infrastructure bond, attracting as high as 18%. And it is tax-free. That is really expensive for the government. To the point that, like this year, we are going to spend 750 billion on interest payments alone. So what are we doing? And fortunately, the circumstances in the market have changed to the point that now we don't have inflationary pressures. Last month, inflation came down to 2.7%. That's very good. The exchange rate is very stable, thanks to the good job the central bank team is doing. So the danger that we may get by lowering the interest rate is gone. So what is our priority now is to ensure that the interest rates come down.
Continue to plane down.
Continue to come down to the point that we can have very significant savings on the money we are spending on paying the domestic debt service. That will give us a lot of headroom. That will ensure that then we start even reducing the total amount of domestic borrowing that we are having. So we have a very clear plan on what we want to do in the immediate to medium term.
So, but in boxing they say the boxers have a good plan until you get socked in the teeth. And essentially, with recent developments, for example, the elections in the United States, President Trump being a look inwards, make America great again. In fact, pundits already talking about maybe enhanced inflation and again, rates to tame them. So what are the options that are available for you to achieve the things that you've been talking about? I know, of course, the concessional lending might still be out there. There are different ways to start to run this. So what are the options that we are looking at?
What we are looking at is to work with institutions that, for example, from the external borrowing side, work with institutions that can continue to give us very low-cost loans that we can use to finance our development activities, but at the same time, where we go into the market, we don't want to go into the market at very high interest rates. We want to go into the market with instruments that can also be guaranteed by institutions such as the World Bank. So currently, the World Bank has come up with a new set of institutions such as what we call sustainability-linked bonds.
Yes.
It's a bond that is used to finance development, but in areas that are related to, for example, climate change and so on.
Yes.
So those instruments are coming in at very competitive interest rates. So those are the instruments that we want to focus on going forward. Where necessary, we will also explore the possibility of working with development partners to do the debt swaps, where we agree with the development, like we just did this recently with Germany. We are looking at other bilaterals where we talk to our development partners and they give us an instrument which is much cheaper, and the savings that we realize, we target some specific interventions. If it is targeting educational institutions, if it is targeting investment in health, if it is targeting investment in energy, then we do that. But the new instrument that has come in to replace the old instrument must be very, very competitive. Yes.
One instrument which has gotten a bad name recently, but was one of the basket that should be explored more extensively, the PIPs and the PPPs, because then it moves that debt off the government books and puts it in the pockets of private investors. That's meaning we don't have to pay the exorbitant rates, and this can be worked off. A simple example is the expressive, which is working. Maybe talk to us about what the intent of that is, even away from the politics.
Actually, I was hoping that was going to be my concluding statement.
Yes.
But let's take it now that you are on it. Now, I think going forward again, we have to start thinking beyond debt.
Yes.
We have to start thinking of what are the mechanisms that we can have in place where we can finance our development without necessarily incurring additional debt. So what are the options?
Yes.
One is public-private partnerships. I think this has been bastardized for a very long time, but it's a very good instrument if it is well administered. We have got PPPs. The expressway here is an example. When I was coming to the studio, I was also imagining I would be late. Thanks to the expressway, I got here in good time. And that is happening. We can do that with major roads, like, for example, the road that we have been thinking of doing from Rironi to Mau Summit and all the way to the other side. That can be done. Part of the SGR that we want to construct to Malaba, we can think of seeing how partially it can be financed through PPPs. Now, that then reduces the burden on the exchequer, then eventually we lower the debt service burden. But in addition to that, we also really have to drive an agenda where we run eventually very low deficits and eventually balanced budget, where we stop accumulation or rapid accumulation of debt. And that is why the National Treasury is currently pursuing what we are calling fiscal consolidation, where progressively we reduce the budget deficits as we go forward and run what we call a primary surplus to be able to stop further accumulation of debt. That's what we need to stop.
Do you actually think that we can get to budget even status like we so nearly saw around the first era of the Kibaki administration, where it planned and we were actually starting to finance everything?
We can do that very easily once we reduce the current debt service pressures and we make more efforts, like the strategies being pursued by our tax policy team to work with KRA to modernize tax collection instruments and we improve our tax revenue collection. We can do that. I've worked in countries which are small and struggling but running balanced budget. I worked in Zimbabwe for some years and despite being small, there was a time when they ran their budget for 3 years, a balanced budget, without, they were relying heavily on whatever they have collected. However little it is, plus the grants that their development partners was able to give them, you could do that. We saw a radical step in our neighborhood, Tanzania, when President Magufuli came in. They reduced their budget from budget deficit from 4% to 2% in 1 year. And they were doing fairly well. They were still financing development. So there are things that we can do, particularly in streamlining expenditure, stopping expenditure leakages, and so on, to make sure that eventually we run a budget that is having very low deficits or a balanced budget.
Even as we conclude, we've recently started to see innovation in this space, where bilateral lending is starting to come in, but with significant focus on certain aspects of the economy. An example is the lending from the Indian government that is coming in through banks and focusing on specifically buying machinery for the manufacturing sector. Talk to us about the sort of the sort of impact that can have on the targeted sectors in the economy.
Yeah, that is would be a good way, because you borrow knowing very well that this is what we want to do with the money, but it is actually not new.
Yes.
Historically, we have had even governments like Spain giving us financing, but financing is tied to, for example, providing equipment to Kenyatta National Hospital. So it is not really too new.
Not new, yes.
It is a good way of making sure that the money effectively reaches the use for which it is meant. But the best option, a better option, if I may say, is what we call the budget support. Why? Because this provides flexibility. If we have to rely on a bilateral insisting that the money that is coming must go for equipment of a hospital, we may find that at that time, the pressure that we are having is to fund the university education. So at that time, the priority may not be only the hospital, but also other priorities. So if you tie what is coming to just one particular area, then that restricts the flexibility of the government. The preference would be, yes, you can agree with them, even if it is an instrument or a loan that is financing social sector projects, the government has the leeway to actually indicate what is it that we are going to finance within the social spending. If it is as on roads, then the government has the leeway of agreeing with the donor that we are going to finance the following range of roads.
In 30 seconds, your concluding remarks, sir.
My concluding remarks is that we have to learn to go beyond debt going in future through enhanced revenue collection, expenditure rationalization, and getting into mechanisms such as PPPs that are non-debt creating.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
All right. Well, that has been the Director of Public Debt Management at the National Treasury. He is Raphael Owino Otieno, taking the time to talk to us. Thank you very much, sir, for your time.
Thank you, Peter.